probably the better
Okay.
Makes sense.
Okay, so shir dedicated to the Cholim of Klal Yisrael and also to my gran. Her name was Yeta. I don't know her Hebrew name. She would have been 100 years old today. And this amazing lady never, for the last year, she had a stroke 20 years before she passed, was in a wheelchair with a carer, never complained, never shouted at anyone, never criticized. It's always with a happy disposition. So it's not easy for people in that situation to have that kind of outlook on life. So anyway, continue with the theme of partnering with non-Jews or involvement with non-Jews on Shabbat. So it says here, contemporary poskim are in agreement that one should do his utmost to avoid entering into any type of Shabbos partnership with a non-Jew, since these documents and arrangements are complex and confusing, and they tend to cause a general lessening of sensitivity towards Shabbos observance, especially among one's children who are not able to understand why a Jewish business could be operating on Shabbat. As the Chofetz Chaim himself tells us in Biur Halacha, those who are careful to keep Shabbat in its pure, simple form and do not look for any leniencies or loopholes will surely be blessed with much business success during the rest of the week. One will not need to rely on Shabbos profits for the sake of his livelihood. Okay, let's leave it at that, and we'll continue a new topic next time.
Okay, good. Well done, and may this 400th shir be a aliyah for all of our ancestors, grandparents, those that have lost parents, for all their neshamas, and just, guys, I'm so proud of you. I'm really.
Amen. And you, shkach, and kol hakavod to you, our teacher, our rabbi, our Rosh Hashiva, shkach to you. Thank you.
And Kev, thanks for teaching us halachas. Arthur with Rabbi Cohen, and Gavin with kahuna status, priestliness, and we've just got a wonderful group of friends we learn. It's just amazing. I love all of you. Yeah, Arthur?
About the thing that he said about making a profit on Shabbos. What does the prophet do on Shabbos?
And thank you guys for your sense of humor. We're going to be learning about stolen items and lame items, like the jokes, stolen from other comedians and lame in all its respects. We're going to be learning it right now about stolen lambs and things like that. So I think it's quite appropriate. Let's just do a bit of chazorah for a few minutes. So Rava said, Rabba challenged Rav Yosef with this problem for 22 years, and it was not resolved until Rav Yosef, upon the death of Rabba, sat at the head of the Academy of Pundesa and resolved it as follows. So we learned that Rav Yosef took over from Rabba, and he received divine providence to be able to answer certain questions, so that Rabba was, as we said, an absolute genius, and Rav Yosef was incredibly bright. Rabba was just gifted in a different way, and he needed that extra divine help to get the respect of that generation since he took over from Rabba. And he said a change of name is the same as a physical change. So in other words, just as a physical change in a stolen article affects acquisition by the thief, so too a change in the stolen article's name affects acquisition by a thief. Well, what is the reason a physical change affects acquisition? Because in that case, the stolen article was originally wood, and now it's deemed a utensil. So too, with respect to a change of name, using the case of hards as an example, originally they were called a hard, and now they're called a mat or a tray, etc. So basically, Rav Yosef argues that it is this change of name that affects the thief's acquisition of the hard, not the owner's despair itself. That's according to Rashi. Remember, Tosfot said that it's actually both, that Rav Yosef argues both ways, that it's a change of name in conjunction with the despair that affects acquisition, because Rav Yosef holds that the owner's despair by itself is not powerful enough. and a change of name is not significant enough like a physical change. So both are needed. So that's the slight difference between Rashi and Tosfot, as you know. And then in order to deal with this issue, the Gemara brings a challenge to Rav Yosef. And he said, look, in the case of the stolen crossbeam that a thief brought into a mansion, where there's a change of name, for occasionally, Arthur, we lost you there for a second. Just hang on a second.
Sorry, mate. It's sometimes crashing. I think I must uninstall the Zoom and put it back just now.
Please.
For some reason it keeps crashing.
Okay, so I don't know where I lost you, but it's just revision. So let's just go carry on. I don't want to reiterate what I've done. So Rav Yosef's assertion that a change of name of title affects acquisition, the Gemara challenges it, and it's bringing a case of a stolen crossbeam that a thief built into a mansion where there's a change of name. Because originally it was called a crossbeam and now it's called a ceiling. And yet we learned in a Mishnah, and what Mishnah is that? In Gittin 55a, it's a 5th chapter, that that 5th chapter deals with various rabbinical enactments that were issued for the benefit of society, according to Rashi, okay? And one of them is that the original owner takes only the value as compensation, but he may not force the thief to return the crossbeam itself, because there was a special rabbinical enactment to assist those that would be willing to repent, but found it extremely difficult to repent, because nobody is going to, guys, tear their house down, including their ceiling, to return a single beam to the owner. So now this prevents the owner from doing teshuvah, when in fact all the thief has to do is come clean and pay the financial equivalent at Builder's Warehouse, so that the original owner can buy the same beam. He doesn't have to dismantle his house, otherwise the person's not going to come clean. So it's not beneficial to anybody that way. So it's in order so that the thief can do teshuvah. Now the reason he's not required to return the crossbeam itself is that the rabbis gave him this exemption of an enactment to assist him that wished to repent. So what does this prove? Very simply, it's not the special enactment, it's a special enactment that allows him to repent, but it has nothing to do with the change of name. Does that make sense? In other words, this Mishnah from Gittin 55a is saying to Rav Yosef, listen, it's not because it was called a crossbeam and now it's called part of a ceiling that affects acquisition. It has nothing to do with that. The reason why the owner has to pay the financial equivalent is not because the thief has now acquired it, but simply because no thief is going to dismantle his house. And therefore, this is not a proof that a change of name is going to affect acquisition. The reason why he's paying the financial equivalent is not because he's acquired it and therefore paying the equivalent, it's because he's not going to break his house down. So this is a proof against you that a change of name affects acquisition. So now Rav Yosef, it's a pretty good argument. Rav Yosef, if you remember, responded to that objection as follows. He said, look, in the case of a crossbeam, its original name remains with it even after it has been built into a ceiling. Because in the case that you bring in Gittin 55a, when it's part of a ceiling, it's known as ceiling, because you don't address, as we said yesterday, a human being and say, I'd like to speak to Arthur's ears now. When I'm speaking to Arthur, his ears are hearing me, hopefully, if I'm not boring. And then it's part of his anatomy, but I don't address his ears directly as a component of Arthur. So too with the beam. I don't address the beam and say, oh, it's the beam. We're saying it's a ceiling. It's got bricks, it's got wood, it's got this, it's got that. So yes, they are referring to a ceiling, but it's not an irreversible change. Why? Because, Kevin, what happens is if the thief had to dismantle a ceiling, he could still take the beam out and return it to the original owner. So therefore, the beam hasn't changed in name. That's what Rav Yosef is responding to the Gemara of this objection to him. He's saying the case that you bring in, there's not really a change of name. So I agree with you in your case, the rabbinical enactment affects the acquisition. Well, it doesn't affect the acquisition, but you pay the financial equivalent. Because it's now called a ceiling and was called a beam. But if you had to dismantle the ceiling, guess what? Get back the original beam, and when you hand it to the guy, he can see it's a beam, he calls it a beam. So this isn't a valid argument against me. Then we also see that he needs a proof. So what proof does he bring? He brings a source from Ezekiel's vision of the future Beis HaMikdash. And it's in Ezekiel chapter 41, verse 26. What does it say? It says, the verse states, I was shown the salos of the temple. These are the casings. And the ubim, these are the crossbeams. So we see from this brisa that even after the crossbeams are built into the ceiling, they're still referred to as crossbeams. This is Rav Yosef's proof. Now, if you don't like that answer, there is an alternative answer as to why the crossbeams are not acquired by the account of their change of name. Rav Zera says a change that is reversible in the case of a change in name does not constitute a change that affects acquisition. For the reason we stated is as follows. It's a beam. I build a ceiling, I put cement, it's now part of a ceiling. I smash down the cement, I pull out the beam, what is it again? It's a beam. It's a cross beam. Why? Because it's not like the case, Kevin, of Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel with a harlot that changes olives into olive oil, where you can never change it back into olives. That's an irreversible change. So Rav Zera is saying where there's a reversible change, the change of name doesn't stick as a reason for affecting acquisition. And in some opinions, even Rashi says that anything that has a physical change, like you build a chair out of wood, Kevin, you keep falling asleep, buddy. Your eyes are closing, man.
Okay.
You want to stand?
Okay. No, it's fine. I'm had a long day.
Flag of Eretz Israel, you can stand if it's going to make you feel better. Shame.
I'll sit up in the chair.
Okay. I know you're exhausted, but it's at 400. Try and keep awake just for this one. Just for this one. So what we were going to say is if you make a chair, according to Rashi, right, and that chair comes from wood, and you smash the chair, the guy's still got wood back. It's different in the case where you're taking olives and you're pressing it into olive oil. That's irreversible. So even Rashi holds that an irreversible physical change, never mind a name change, doesn't constitute effecting acquisition. But many of the Rabbonim say, in fact, it does affect acquisition, a physical change that is reversible. But certainly not necessarily, according to Rav Zera, a name change that is reversible. Because in that case, it was called what it was once called, it doesn't affect it. Okay, so that's what we dealt with before. Now, we're going to deal with an issue we dealt with the other day. I just want to add a little bit more clarity. So on Saturday night, we dealt with this issue, and we were talking about a mikveh. And we said, what is a mikveh in a nutshell? It's a body of standing water in which people or utensils are immersed to purify them of their tumah. So in order to be effective, the mikveh must contain at least 40 se'ah of naturally gathered water. So what you can't do is take buckets and put it in. It's got to be rainwater or ocean water. It's got to gather there naturally. And water that was contained in the vessel, in other words, drawn water or shivun, is not fit for a mikveh because that's mankind manipulating water from a bucket and it disqualifies it for use. In fact, if you use 3 lugin or more of added water by human intervention, it actually renders the mikveh disqualified. Pasur, disqualified, exactly, until that's removed. So what we're talking about here is that's the context of the case, okay? So the Gemara says, right, okay. In this particular case, you've got, for example, when we're looking at mikvah os in chapter 2, verse 3, it says, all right, what you have here is a case where there's a block of wood, and it was hollowed out to form a plumbing pipe. And originally it was called a block of wood, and now it's called a plumbing pipe. And it was taught in a bracer, a pipe that one first hollowed out from a block of wood, and then you attach it to the ground, disqualifies the mikveh if it's used to channel water into the mikveh. Because now it's human intervention. You're manipulating the water to go in there. For such a pipe is considered a vessel, despite the fact that it's now attached to the ground. But if you first attached it to the ground while it was still a block of wood and then hollowed it out, it doesn't disqualify a mikveh if it's used to channel water in the mikveh, because such a pipe is considered part of the ground rather than a vessel. So what it's saying there is basically if you make a water estuary, Kev, and you allow, like say you on there's a valley and there's a hill, and on the hill you create carvings where the water can fall within at the bottom of a valley and create a mikveh, that's kosher because the rainwater still comes of its own volition and you've made it as part of the ground. It's natural. But the minute you start carrying water or have plumbing pipes or things like that, it's human intervention which disqualifies a mikveh. So you take a block of wood, you make this pipe, and then you fit it to the ground. It's a utensil. So in that particular case, it's intervention and it's disqualifying the mikveh. But if you take the block of wood and build it as attached to the ground and then carve it on the ground, it's technically allowed because you've almost like created a structure from the ground and you haven't created a utensil. Listen, we don't come from that time period. It doesn't make sense to me, but I don't know anything about that time period. The rule is basically, if you make it from the ground or something attached to the ground, it's not considered manipulated and disqualifies the mikveh. If you make the tool or you make the machinery, anything to do with manipulation and then attach it to the ground, it disqualifies the mikveh. So what it's saying is it's actually the order in which you do it that affects things. So it's saying now, if you want to say that a change of name is a legally significant matter, then even if you first attached it to the ground and then hollowed it out, the mikveh should be disqualified. So what it's saying is, look, originally it was called a block of wood. The name is now changed to a plumbing pipe. So since there's a change of name, and that affects a legally changed status, either way it should be disqualified. It shouldn't matter if you attach it to the ground afterwards, or if you changed it from the block of wood to a plumbing pipe from the ground. Either way, it should be disqualified because it's considered that a change of name has meant you've manipulated a block of wood into a utensil. What's a better word for utensil which we'd use modern? We wouldn't use vessel. It. We'd call it a vessel or a tool. That's exactly it. It's a vessel, Kevin. That's exactly it. So in other words, you've taken something natural and you've changed the name to something unnatural and man-made, manipulated, like a vessel containing water and piping it into a certain direction. So therefore, change of name, if that affects a legal change, then it shouldn't matter whether you built it and then attached it to the ground or then attached it to the ground and built it. That change of name shows a different status, and therefore a change of name would prove a legal change. But the fact that it doesn't in this case is a proof against a change of name having any sort of legal status. Now, there are two issues, guys, you should notice. That there was a physical change that took place, so that should be enough to render it legally counting, despite the name change. The very fact that it physically took on a role of a vessel and a distribution of water now, compared to a block of wood itself, without the name, should affect a different legal status. So the change of name, for me, I don't quite get it. And also I don't get why an issue of a change of name, which deals with an acquisition issue, has anything to do with a completely different issue of a mikveh. Because a mikveh, we're talking about here, the one is deemed as man manipulating it, and the other one is deemed as man using the natural resource and not affecting it too much with his own sort of manipulation and intervention. Do you get my issue with it? Is that the physical change itself would affect acquisition, even if there's no name change. It's changed its status, and even if you want to say, well, the name change should disqualify it either way, what does an article which you acquire have anything to do with a halacha with regards to a mikveh? The two are two different issues. The one is about human intervention, and the other one is about acquisition. I'm just telling you my own personal grasp. That's all. Which means, quite clearly, I don't understand the nuances of what it's trying to bring, even though I understand the argument it's bringing. I just don't understand why it would particularly be relevant. But anyway, the Gemara answers it, and it says that the law with respect to the disqualification of water through drawing, in other words, as Kevin said, from drawing from a vessel source and directing it in a certain way, it's actually of rabbinic origin. Okay? So, in other words, it's only a rabbinic stringency according to the poskim, and therefore it's slightly different in that indeed a change in name is legally significant, and even a block of wood that was first attached to the ground and then hollowed out into a pipe is still technically called by a different name, a vessel. But the law is that drawn water disqualifies a mikveh is only a rabbinic stringency, not derisive, not biblical, and the rabbis applied it only to a vessel detached from the ground, not a vessel that is attached to the ground. Make sense? Does? Okay, so they're saying it's not an issue, but the Gemara is going to ask an obvious question. And that question had been, if so, that the rabbis did not apply this rabbinic stringency with respect to a vessel attached to the ground, then even in the Bryce's first case as well, where the pipe was first hollowed out and then attached to the ground, the disqualification should not apply. In other words, originally the Gemara thought that the reason that the Bryce differentiates between the first and the second case is that in the first case, where the wood was hollowed into a pipe before it was attached to the ground, it was considered a vessel, whereas in the second case, where the wood was first attached to the ground and then hollowed out, it was not considered a vessel. Now we're learning that the Gemara explained that either way, the hollowed out wood is considered a vessel, even in the Bryce's second case. And the reason that it doesn't disqualify a mikveh is that in the second case, that the rabbis did not apply the rabbinic disqualification of drawn water to a vessel. If you attached it to the ground before you started creating the vessel. And the same should hold true in the Bryce's first case. Okay, that's the question the Gemara is asking. So now, basically the Gemara answers, there in the Bryce's first case, where the wood was first hollowed into a pipe and then attached to the ground, but already at the status of a vessel while it was still unattached. So the rabbinic disqualification from being used for a mikveh had already taken effect, and it's not removed after it's subsequently attached to the ground. In the Bryce's second case, where the wood was first attached to the ground and then hollowed into a pipe, it didn't have the status of a vessel while it was unattached, okay? And then therefore the rabbinic disqualification doesn't take effect initially on the vessel that is attached to the ground. That's the reason. Does that make sense? So you can't make something unkosher and then make it kosher. You've got to make it kosher from the get-go first, and then fit within those rules, and then it doesn't get rabbinically disqualified. Pretty straightforward stuff. Okay. Now, what, Gav? Gav, can you hear me? Guys, can you hear me? Guys,
for the last 30 seconds.
Okay, that's fine, but you get it. All right. So how long do we have left? I just want to see.
Just over 10 minutes.
Does the time appear on your
13.
side? Doesn't appear on my side. How many minutes?
No, I don't know time, but I can see. Well, you started at 6:20, so it's
All right.
about 13 minutes.
All right.
14
So
minutes.
let's just try and see if we can cover a little bit of ground. No pun intended, as Kevin would given that sort of thing. So the Gemara presents another challenge to Rav Yosef's ruling that despair does not affect acquisition. So they challenge Rav Yosef from the following brisa. In the case of a thief, a robber, and an expropriator. Do you know what well, guys, you know expropriation, what it means? Okay? South African Land Act, meaning that they've taken it from people that have paid, white people that have paid for the land, and taken it back. Because 10 generations ago, when they didn't build a 2-story hut out of wood, out of mud, they never rode horses, they never had indoor plumbing, they never had anything. They want to give it back 5 generations, even though somebody paid for the house in today's generation. So, Kevin, your parents in Sandringham paid for a house. They've got the deed. They paid a fortune. By law now, some local indigenous person can take it back because their ancestors owned it. Doesn't matter that your parents paid full price. That's called expropriation. So it's got a negative connotation. And what's the difference between a thief and a robber and an expropriator, Arthur? You learned Rabbi Cohen. Arthur, you're not asleep. I know you can hear me.
Yeah, no, I'm not asleep. Actually, I don't know. Okay, I know the robber and the thief.
Okay. So an expropriator is a guy that comes to a person with 5, he's a mafia guy. Kev, you're falling asleep every second. Expropriator.
Let me try. Is that the one where somebody takes it away, basically takes it away from you legally without you agreeing to have it taken away?
Yes, how he does it is it's a mafia guy that brings 4 henchmen and says they're going to put your head through the toilet and rip it through your tuchus. And what happens is they say, sign an agreement so that you sell it to me, and they pay you cents on the rand. In other words, that something is worth a lot more than it is, but he said, I wanted
So
legally.
basically full value at the moment.
It's extortion, Arthur. What it is I hear the joke. Let's just cover a little bit. I get it.
Okay.
So, come on, guys. Let's just cover a bit of ground. I've actually worked quite hard to get this. So, thief or robber and an expropriator is the same. It's somebody that's actually doing it legally, but they're forcing you against your will. So, what it's saying is both a thief or robber and a extortionist or an expropriator, as it's known as then, never got your consent. So, you didn't actually give them a right. So to do it. So therefore, it's puzzling that this brisa says that which these people consecrated is consecrated. So if a thief, a robber, or a mafia extortionist took your article, and in the case of extortionist paid you, but it was against your will, it's considered consecrated. And if they designate it as teruma, it's teruma, and that which they designate as maisa is maisa. Now, you're dealing with a case in the Gemara where your mafia guy felt bad and he wanted to give his tzedakah to the poor. He didn't mind making somebody poor, but he gave his tzedakah to the poor. Okay. You get what I'm saying? So what it's saying is here, guys, is that this person never gave his consent for the thief, or robber, or expropriator. And yet these bad, wicked people took the article, and when they consecrated it, it's deemed consecrated. And that which they designate as teruma is teruma, and that which they designate as maisa is maisa. Now, how can you consecrate nor designate as teruma or maisa that which is not his? Evidently, then, the brisa refers to where the owner despaired of recovering the stolen goods, and the brisa maintains that despair affects acquisition. So what it's trying to do here is say maybe the fact that the original owner despaired at getting it back, it now becomes the thief or extortioners or robbers, and therefore he can consecrate it or give maisa or teruma on it. And therefore that despair affects Yush acquisition. So the Gemara deflects the challenge, and they said Guys, have I lost you or can you still hear me? So the Gemara defects the challenge, and it said there is a case at the Brisa that there is a change of name, which affects acquisition. For originally when they took it, it was called Tevel, and now it's called Teruma. With respect to consecration, originally it was called Chulin, and now it was called Hekdesh. So the Gemara's answer seems a little bit difficult because it's saying, hang on a second, if you're just saying that a change of name affects acquisition, we know that it's not totally true because it's not super significant. It has to go in conjunction with almost despair. The two work hand in hand with each other. And yet despair itself isn't good enough to effect acquisition. Why? Because we learned that you can't do an Aveira, do a mitzvah from an Aveira. You can't give Maisa money, Tzedakah money, Teruma, or something from something you stole. Okay? So how did Rabbi get past it last time? We said, look, one of the other rules of despair is it has to be stolen from that person's property. If he consecrated it to the temple already, or whatever the case may be, and it's out of his domain, despair works within, according to Rav Yosef, that person's domain. In other words, only when you find it missing in your place do you despair. If you've already given it to the Chevra Kadesha or the Beis HaMikdash or whatever, you don't know what's happened to it there. It's not in your property, you don't despair. So despair affects acquisition only if it's stolen from your place, number one. And number two, a change of name only affects acquisition if it's combined with despair. Does that make sense, guys? Guys, I'm really battling to get a response from you guys.
Change of name will only be effective if it's combined with despair, if it's in conjunction.
Absolutely, because
then,
if you have
resulting in
the fact that a change in the acquisition. So firstly, we learned before that if you despair, you can't take the goods because you can't do a mitzvah with the goods like Teruma, Maisa, consecration, any of those sort of things, and do it from an Aveira of theft or extortion, etc. Yeah. So even despair doesn't affect acquisition. So Rabbi answered last time, look, you're talking about something that was already consecrated in Hekdesh, in property owned by the Most High, and then taken from the Kohen to another Kohen. So it's no longer in the original owner's domain. Because despair doesn't affect acquisition for something that you wish to steal and then say to give it to tzedakah, etc. So firstly, the premises on which it's stolen plays a role. The fact that despair has to come before acquisition plays a role. And a change of name, that's what it's saying. It has to also be a change of name. Because originally when they took it, it was called Tevel, now it's called Teruma. It was called Kulin, and now it's called Hekdesh. So it's also a change of name of how it's referred to, as well as the state of despair, as well as the fact that it's changed location. And this was taken not at the homeowner, but already when it was at the Beis HaMikdash, or alternatively, it was sold to a second party. And that second party then took it for consecration. So it's one step removed. So in other words, you're not on the same thing as stealing it, dedicating it to the temple, because the act of taking it from mundane to holy is the act of location removal and reassignment. So you can't do that act, which is theft, within the same act of a mitzvah of reassigning it from privately owned to Hekdesh. But you can technically sell it, and then they can consecrate it. And then it takes a change of location. It's one step removed, it's not direct. It's despair of the owner, and it's a change of name. Okay? So as far as that's concerned, that's pretty clear. Now, just one thing is, all right, so there's about 4 minutes, there's about 4 minutes left. I think we can do the other 4 minutes another time. I think I'm